This is the first video program for a Catholic overview of the Bible. It accompanies Lesson 6. Take a picture of the world from the atlas and you will see it took millions of years for this planet to form under the hand of God. We marvel that in His grand design He planned geographical configurations where just the necessary history, His story, would take place to work for the salvation of beloved man He would form in this place. Geography, rich lands, hills, water sources, barren deserts, impassable mountains, all the features of the land determine the history that mankind will experience. The life of the communities will be indelibly affected by the nature that is given to them to work for or against. The society of an area is what it is because of the gifts and difficulties of the land and the climate. In forming the earth, God was planning salvation history by the forces He allowed to make one small place. Note how small is that place, about the size of a pencil lead at the end of the Mediterranean Sea. Here then, at the end of the Mediterranean Sea, is the tiny land of Canaan, later called Israel. A great rift valley, that dotted line, extends out of Africa up through the Dead Sea, the Jordan Valley, and the Sea of Galilee. A short distance to the east is the hostile Arabian Desert, which forces civilization to form along the bordering rivers, the Tigris and Euphrates to the east, the Jordan and the Nile to the west. Because of the shape of these rivers, the land around them is called the Fertile Crescent. Egypt in the east, and a string of civilizations in what is now Iraq and Syria. With the only way of contact between the great early civilizations of the east and west being through Canaan, geography forced great movements back and forth across this land, movements of peoples that God would use in His great plan of salvation. The first known civilization was Sumer, at the head of the Persian Gulf. Later, Babylon claimed this area. Further north along the great rivers were the nations of Akkad and Mammary, and still further north the region where Assyria would later grow into greatness. The Amorites came from what is now northern Syria, and the Hittites had a great kingdom in central Turkey. From Egypt through Canaan, around the Arabian Desert, and down to lower Mesopotamia at the Persian Gulf is 1,200 miles. Important cities of the ancient world were on this crescent. Many were known to Abraham in his travels: Haran, Mammary, Jerusalem, and Jericho. To help us understand the size of the land of Israel, where the Bible, so much of it takes place, here we have Israel superimposed on the map of Maine. Maine is certainly not one of the larger of our states. When we place it on the map of Maine, we have an awkward comparison, but it may help grasp what a small area ancient Canaan or Israel is, where the story of Genesis and most of the Old Testament takes place. Here we have Jerusalem, which is the green circle, and then we have at the north a light circle, or I guess it's an oval, which would be Dan, and to the south another one which would be Beersheba, which in the Bible is often stated to represent the area from Dan to Beersheba. Within this small land is every conceivable type of terrain, from badlands to lush orchards, from scanty grazed hills to rich farmlands, from the deadest place on earth, the Dead Sea, to fertile oases, from rushing waters to barren deserts, from snowy mountain heights to the lowest point on earth. An archaeological image from the old kingdom of Sumer. We have a Sumerian here, pictured against a village that is reproduced from various sources to show us how the Sumerians were living along the backwaters of the Euphrates River. By 3000 BC, Sumer was a great non-Semitic civilization lying between the Tigris and the Euphrates near the Persian Gulf. The valley supported a civilization upon whose inventions we still depend, notably the arch and the wheel, the elements of astronomy, written language, and a mathematics common to us based upon tens, as well as sixes, with which we still tell time and mark the degrees of the circle. River reeds were used for houses and boats in the Sumerian civilization. Far away in the background can be seen the great step temple of called a ziggurat. Sumer was comprised of walled city-states, and wars were not uncommon between them. A picture taken about 1950, I would suppose. Boats of this kind were still being used on the Euphrates for 5,000 years. This is the remains of a school uncovered at Mammary, capital of the Mammary nation on the Euphrates in Upper Mesopotamia. Reading and writing were common 3,700 years ago among this settled people. Here some 25,000 clay tablets were discovered. Students sat on benches and wrote with styluses on clay tablets. Afterward, the clay could be re-kneaded and reused or baked for permanency. Tablets, sometimes flat and sometimes circular, were stored in clay envelopes. The great palace of Mammary, uncovered by archaeologists, had 260 apartments and courtyards. A great library was found in this complex of buildings. On some tablets are names we recognize as those of the Bible patriarchs, which are also names of locations. We see in Genesis that place names were often given to persons, as the name Haran, brother of Abraham, is also a place name in northern Mesopotamia. Abraham would have met covered ox carts like this when he migrated from to Haran. Sumer had developed the wheel about 3,500 BC. A Sumerian war chariot dating from 2,500 BC, which is 600 years before Abraham's life began in the city of Wars were common between city-states, who also had to hold nomadic invaders from the fringes of the deserts, who were always looking for more fertile grazing lands and an easier life. The ziggurat of was built by King Namu, upon whose top was a temple named Etemnanki, meaning the building of the foundation platform of heaven and earth, whose top reaches to heaven. The base of the ziggurat was 90 by 90 by 30 meters, which is 145 feet by 145 feet by 45 feet high. On the highest level stood this temple to the god. Buildings like this astounded the Hebrew nomad, who was used to flat reaches of semi-desert. They seemed an effrontery to God because of their height. They inspired the story of the Tower of Babel, which the Holy Spirit used to carry his message about universal sin. A great library of clay documents was uncovered at Ebla in Syria in 1964. These archives of 15,000 to 20,000 pieces are adding much to our understanding of ancient history, as they date back to 2300 BC, within 400 years of Abraham. An artist imagines the family of Abraham leaving Haran to follow God's call to Canaan. Note the clothing and the animals, the pack animals, and the beehive houses in the background, which have been unchanged for at least 4,000 years. This picture was taken in northern Syria by the National Geographic Society, where people live in just such kinds of houses. The two strongest nations during Abraham's lifetime were the Hittite Empire in central Turkey and Egypt. During their height of power, Hittites lived in many parts of the Near East. To bury Sarah, Abraham bought the cave of Machpelah from Hittites who were living in Canaan. The 400 shekels were probably in the form of silver jewelry measured out with a scale. All that remains of the ancient Hittite capital are these ruins. The Hittites were metal workers, and through military power controlled the richest silver and iron mines in all of Asia Minor. Unlike other maps that face north, this one faces west and gives us a better idea of the active trade routes from Ur and Sumer on the low left, along the river and around, skirting the Great Desert, through Haran, Damascus, Bethel, Hebron, Beersheba, and on to Egypt. All these were places Abraham traveled to and through. By his time, this route was well established, 1,500 miles from one end to the other. Metals were traded from the Hittites, gold from Egypt, textiles and foodstuffs from the farmlands along the rivers, fine pottery from Asia Minor, and lumber from the forests of Lebanon. Arab families, here pictured from the National Geographic, still live in the ancient ways, but now in comfortable tents with Persian rugs on the ground and portable electrical generators to support the TV. But Abraham would still recognize this culture. The nomadic Arab today is a follower of Islam. He is totally free and independent of any government or law. Since the time of Ishmael, he has been known as a wild ass of a man, his hand against every man, and every man's hand against him, in Genesis 16:12. This modern Arab woman, living a nomadic life, may well resemble Rachel or Rebecca. Not a Hebrew, but an Arab, she is nevertheless a Semite cousin. Note the ring in her nose, like the one Rebecca was given by Abraham's servant. This old Semite couple, again from National Geographic, probably looking very much like Abraham and Sarah, show their love for each other. This is the modern city of Aleppo, not far from where Abraham and his family lived at Haran. In the center of the city is a tell, which is a mound of the remains of ruined cities, each one built upon the rubble of the past, that have stood on this site since before the time of the patriarchs. This city has the flavor of all the Near East cities, whose roots go back to the ancient past. More recently, the Syrian uprising or revolution has been very hard on this city, where many of the battles have been fought. This is an artist's sketch of the ancient city of Jericho, probably one of the oldest cities on earth, maybe 9,000 to 10,000 years old. The archaeologists believe that the earliest houses had rounded leather roofs, which is what the artist tries to depict here, behind a stone wall. The ancient plastered skull speaks of some kind of death ritual dating back 9,000 years. Today's city of Jericho is 280 feet below sea level and is watered by an oasis. Jericho has been a site for winter palaces of the later kings of Israel, because it is warm when other parts of the country feel the winter chill, sometimes even a little snow. Abraham avoided cities like this and stayed in the open highlands where he pastured his flocks. Abraham entered Canaan near Shechem. Here his grandson Jacob would come back to pasture his flocks and dig a famous well. Here Jacob's sons would avenge the rape of their sister Dinah on the sons of Shechem. Here, too, Jacob's sons were pasturing flocks when Joseph came to find them, only to be sold by his jealous brothers into slavery. Jacob bought a field in Shechem, the second piece of land in a country God had promised to them. In the background, the two mountains, Ebal and Gerizim, will be the site of Joshua's recovenanting the people to the Lord of the covenant. Jacob's well near Shechem today has an unfinished church around it. Here Jesus also met the woman of Samaria. What was at ground level then is now many feet below the surface. Entering one of the little structures, you descend a long flight of stairs to where an old Greek Orthodox monk sits to take your donation. He then drops a stone down the well. You listen for a second or two and hear the far-off splash. An artist depicts the life of Abraham or Isaac, Jacob, and the sons as they lived in the hills and avoided the large Canaanite walled cities which generally guarded the passes or the great agricultural plains. The freedom of this life in the open hills lent itself to God's revelation of himself to Abraham and his posterity. This is typical sheep country. Sheep can make a living by grazing land that looks very barren. Animals who live off this meager grass sometimes lose the use of their neck muscles and walk along with their mouths nearly on the ground like a vacuum cleaner. The laundry is on the line, and these black Bedouin tents still dot areas of Israel that have these sparse hillsides for their flocks. Living beyond the bounds of organized life and law, they have a reputation even today of obeying only their own traditions. After an infrequent rain, the Negev, where Abraham sojourned, looks like water is no problem. Actually, in order to be fertile, This land must be irrigated, which is one of the important projects of modern Israel. In this older photo, several Bedouin families water their flocks at a water hole in the Negev. Things change slowly, or not at all, in the nomadic culture. This modern view of the Jordan River shows extensive cultivation. In Lot's day, the area was untouched. He chose the Jordan Valley when he separated from Abraham, while Abraham was given the highlands on the east, west, south, and north. At the southern end of the Dead Sea, under a shallow arm of water, lies the ancient city, two of them, cities of Sodom and Gomorrah, which were destroyed and sank under the sea in a cataclysmic event described in Genesis. Everything near or around the sea is salt. A mountain a mile high on the south end of the sea is made of salt. Salt slabs, instigated by mineral mining, float like ice floes on the heavy water. This slide is strangely colored. Surely the lands around the Dead Sea are not red. However, the Dead Sea is the lowest spot on earth and supports no life at all because of the concentration of salts in its water. It has no outlet and is subject to high evaporation rates, which leaves more and more salts behind. In ancient times, it was renowned for its deposits of salt and asphalt. This wonderful tomb painting, discovered in Egypt, gives us a pictorial record of how the family of Abraham looked and dressed. Found at Beni Hassan, an Amorite chieftain, which means a Semitic Westerner of whom Abraham was one, takes his tribe to Egypt around 1900 BC, the very time of Abraham, perhaps during one of the chronic famines in Canaan. Men carry spears and bows. The donkeys carry household goods. A man has a lyre and bows. From another source, we have a cropped version of the same picture, but in color. The clothing is brightly colored and patterned and made of woven wool. Compared to the Egyptians in the painting, the men and women are handsomely Semitic, with dark hair and beards. An artist depicts what he believes Isaac would look like, because Isaac, in addition to following his flocks, began to cultivate land. It was the beginning of a more settled life, and because of the divine blessing on this family, reaped 100-fold. The artists certainly learned from those ancient Egyptian wall paintings how to depict the people of Abraham. And here we have a woman making pots. Women made the pots for the household use. It is the remains of these pots, broken sherds of pottery, that have become the scientific indicators that archaeologists use to date the levels in a dig. Pottery, by its form, material, and decoration, gives the scientist the information he needs to date the levels as the dig goes ever deeper into a tell. Lions once prowled in Canaan. Amos mentions hearing their roar, and Jacob feared that Joseph had been torn by wild beasts. This lion decorates the lid of an ornament box, which dates from the time of the patriarchs. Beersheba became a focal point for the patriarchs' tribal life in the Negev, because important water sources there provided the necessary water for their flocks. Again, we see how those Egyptian tomb paintings have helped artists depict here Esau as a great hunter. Using a powerful convex bow and wooden shafted arrows tipped with flint, he was able to bring game to his father's table. Rebekah and Rachel tended their father's flocks. The wells were covered with a heavy stone, which often took more than one man to move. But Jacob, renowned for his strength, moved one for Rachel. Household gods like these were carried among the family treasures and were set up in a home shrine. Rachel stole her father's and hid them under the saddle. Possessing them gave her inheritance rights. At each new site, it was the woman's work to set up her home. She was adept with the hammer and pegs, which the Bible woman Jael uses to kill Israel's enemy, Sisera. The stories of Genesis were handed down from generation to generation by oral tradition. The stories were inspired by the Holy Spirit of God and were told in meticulous detail under the stars. On Mount Moriah, Abraham willingly laid out his sacrifice, his only son Isaac. This mountain is holy to the Jews, where they built their temple to God, first Solomon's famous temple, and in Jesus' day the temple King Herod built for the Jews. Today, however, this mountain is also holy to the Mohammedans and is the site of the Mosque of Omar, which was built in 600 A.D. Over all these years, it stands in Jerusalem as an offense to the Jews. It is rumored that Orthodox Jews have secretly gathered all the materials necessary to replace the temple to God if and when the opportunity presents itself. To rebuild the temple would require the destruction of this old mosque. The Mosque of Omar is centered around a sacred stone upon which Isaac was about to be sacrificed. This is the inside of the mosque. 1,000 years later, in the time of David, it was also the threshing floor of Araunah, where David determined to build the temple for God. The stone still has the holes drilled to funnel the threshed grain down into the underground storage chambers. Inside the Mosque of Omar is this sacred stone upon which Abraham began a sacrifice to the Lord with his son Isaac. But it also has a sacredness to the Muslims because it supposedly holds the footprint of Muhammad as he left this world and ascended to heaven about 600 A.D. Another sacred Abrahamic site is the oak at Mammary. Here is an ancient tree which in tradition is said to mark the place where Abraham entertained the three angels and where Abraham pitched his tent. It's estimated that this oak is approximately 5,000 years old. The tree was venerated by Jews and Christians for hundreds of years, and after the Russian Revolution, the property came under the control of the Russian Orthodox Catholic Church. A long-standing tradition is that the oak of Abraham will die before the appearance of the Antichrist. The main oak trunk has been dead since 1996, but in 1998 appeared a root sprout. Not far from the oak at Mammary is this tremendous sacred place, also associated with Abraham. It's south of Jerusalem in a city called Hebron, which is often in modern news. A sacred place for both Muslims, Jews, and Christians, because the fathers of all three faiths with their wives lie buried here. This is the site that Abraham bought from the Hittites 4,000 years ago, and here were buried Sarah and Abraham, Isaac and Rebekah, Jacob and Leah. Within this great building, which was raised by Herod the Great near the time of the birth of Jesus, we have the remains of the patriarchs, which, however, are inaccessible in a subterranean cave. Above them are these cenotaphs, imposing structures, which are empty tombs used to focus veneration when those remains are not accessible. This is the Cenotaph of Isaac, and on the left is the edge of the cenotaph for Rebekah. Here we have Arab men, Muslims, venerating the tomb of Isaac. The cenotaph of Abraham himself, where veneration is made to the father of the three great faiths, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. This Muslim shrine is set up to honor Abraham. Though Rachel was Jacob's favorite wife, she was not buried with him because she had died near Bethlehem in childbirth. That child, Benjamin, became Jacob's favorite after Rachel's other son, Joseph, disappeared. This building marks the grave of Rachel. When Abraham went into Egypt, the pyramids were already 500 to 600 years old, and Abraham was escaping famine in Canaan and resided in Egypt for some years. A great civilization flourished along the banks of the Nile earlier than 3500 BC. Ending our first Bible study video here along the Nile, we will be looking at Egypt as playing a very important role in the future of God's people. We will read about this as we continue our study. The acknowledgments of the sources for these pictures are Google Images, Robert Cross, Reader's Digest of the Great People of the Bible, Reader's Digest of the Atlas of the Bible, Westminster Historical Atlas of the Bible, Illustrated Bible Dictionary, National Geographic Magazine, Father Valberg, The Bible is History in Pictures, Holy Views Incorporated, and the Reader's Digest Worldwide Atlas.